Good morning and welcome to this webinar reporting on the results of two recently completed projects that gathered stakeholder input on and investigated the potential for electric utility infrastructure efficiency in Minnesota. I am Mary Sue Lobenstein, the R&D Program Administrator at the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Division of Energy Resources. With me today is Adam Zoet, an Energy Planner Principal at the department, where he fosters coordinated analysis between the Conservation Improvement Program Unit and the Energy Regulation and Planning Unit. He also reviews Utility Conservation Improvement Program triennial plans and annual status reports. Adam oversaw the development and execution of these two studies that are the subject of the webinar today and will be leading the Q&A. Our webinar presenters are Travis Hink from GDS Associates and John Blafus from the Center for Energy and Environment. Travis is an energy plant engineer at GDS, where he provides technical expertise to clients on commercial and industrial energy efficiency issues. He also supports implementation of several utility energy efficiency programs and has been the project manager on several past projects for the Department of Commerce. Travis had a leading role in both EUI projects that we are reporting on today, as well as an earlier EUI project. John is a program coordinator at CEE, where he works with the Director of Program Development to identify new opportunities and develop pilot programs. He provides project management and support to a variety of energy efficiency projects, including both EUI projects that will be discussed in this webinar, in particular, playing an integral part in the stakeholder engagement process. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few webinar basics. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. All questions as they occur to you during the presentation should be typed into the chat box on the GoToWebinar panel and sent to us. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on both the department's and CEE's website at a later date. Finally, there are several handouts for you, including the slide deck for this webinar, as well as the final report from the EUI potential study. In addition, there's also the copy of the EUI draft action plan. So you can download those at any time during the webinar. Here's our agenda for today's webinar, starting with an overview of EUI, what we mean by it, why it's important, and where it fits into the Conservation Improvement Program. As a refresher, we wanted to start by defining what we mean by EUI. EUI is an acronym for Electric Utility Infrastructure and refers to any equipment or facilities owned by a utility that are used to deliver energy to customers. This is everything that is upstream of the meter and includes things like transmission lines, substation transformers, and generation plants. There is potential to increase electric supply side or EUI efficiency by decreasing conversion losses, improving plant operations, and mitigating transmission and distribution losses on the electric grid. Minnesota has a long history of successful utility energy efficiency programs delivered through the Conservation Improvement Program. Efforts received a boost with the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007, which moved utilities in the state from an annual spending goal to a savings goal. This act also permits utilities to count efficiency improvements to utility infrastructure toward their goals. So while this has been allowable in statute for a while, there has not been a significant number of projects or coordinated efforts to increase EUI efficiency. And there's various reasons for this, including low awareness of the opportunity, unclear project eligibility requirements, a lack of prescribed savings calculations, and also the unknown magnitude of the potential for savings. To address these issues, the department initiated a series of projects that was hoping to leverage existing SIP tools and drive EUI efficiency implementation in Minnesota. More specifically, there are 3 projects the department commissioned GDS Associates to complete, along with a team that included the Center for Energy and Environment, CADMIS, and demand-side analytics. One was a project that developed standard measures for calculating energy savings from EUI projects for Minnesota's Technical Reference Manual. A second identified and quantified conservation opportunity in EUI assets owned and operated by utilities. And the third used a stakeholder process to conduct an in-depth exploration of existing incentives and disincentives for utilities to achieve greater system-wide efficiency. Two of these projects were funded by Minnesota's Conservation Applied Research and Development, or CARD program, and the third was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Overall, the objective of these studies were to estimate statewide potential for EUI efficiency, to develop tools to help utilities capture EUI efficiency, to clarify the policy landscape surrounding EUI, and to reduce barriers and ultimately drive implementation of EUI efficiency projects. Today's webinar will look at the results from two of these three projects, the statewide potential study and the statewide stakeholder engagement process. Now I'm going to turn it over to Travis, who will be starting us off by talking about the process and methodology for these studies.
Thanks, Mary Sue, for the introduction. Before I jump right in, I want to highlight what I think is the really important part of Mary Sue's introduction. The key to all of these EUI projects is to find ways to use existing SIP tools that have been shown to be successful on the demand side and apply them to drive infrastructure efficiency. That's the framing to keep in mind throughout this presentation. With a few policy clarifications and some new resources, we hope to unlock a whole sector to give utilities new tools to meet their conservation goals. The pictures here on the slide are a couple examples of possible EUI targets in Minnesota. There's a substation here near St. Cloud, the Sherco generation facility, and some transmission lines that run past near where I grew up in Brooklyn Center. As Mary Sue said, there have now been 3 studies in Minnesota focused on EUI efficiency in Minnesota. The first one produced the TRM measures that we completed back at the end of 2016, and the other 2 are the ones that we're talking about today. The potential study and the stakeholder engagement project. There are 2 separate projects, but in the end they wound up overlapping quite a bit. So if you feel like they start blending together a little bit during the presentation, that's because they do. So we're starting off with the methodology we used to complete the projects. The first thing we want to mention about the process is that both the potential study and the stakeholder engagement project relied heavily on input from an advisory committee. The advisory committee was selected at the beginning of the project. Commerce and CEE reached out to solicit applicants and found a great group of individuals representing a variety of organizations to participate in the committee. They consisted of stakeholders who were willing to put in some extra effort to help the team beyond just attending meetings. So committee members offered feedback on our preliminary findings, they helped direct the project towards useful outcomes, and they really helped out by identifying sources of data that we needed. The advisory committee was kind of behind the scenes, but they were a big part of both the potential study and the stakeholder process. So now I'm going to go over the process we used to complete the projects. First is the potential study. The goal of the potential study is to estimate how much room for improvement there is for infrastructure efficiency in Minnesota, which we call the technical potential, and then estimate how much of that we think utilities can reasonably implement, which we call achievable potential. To do that, we created models based on the TRM for transformers, transmission and distribution conductors, conservation voltage reduction, and heat rate improvements at generation facilities. We then collected data from utilities across the state and also collected information about available technologies and their costs from manufacturers. And we used this data to run our models and produce the estimates for conservation potential. At a high level, that's all there is to it, but this is very high level. The full report contains much more detail on how we developed the models, some of the difficulties we encountered, and then how we overcame those difficulties. As far as we know, this was the first study of its kind, and after figuring out some of the bumps along the way, we're very happy with the final results. And we're especially thankful to the stakeholders who helped us out to collect data about existing infrastructure in Minnesota. Now for the other study, we look at the process behind the stakeholder engagement project. The goal of this project is to clarify policies and create an action plan for stakeholders to go capture the identified infrastructure efficiency potential. The process is a little less linear than the potential study. It's sort of an iterative plan to start the conversation with stakeholders, add as much relevant information as we can, talk about solutions to problems that we come across, and then go back and add more information and keep the conversation going until we come to some sort of consensus on the best ideas going forward, which then constitute the action plan. So the core of this project were 4 large stakeholder meetings. This is where we had presentations from experts in the field. We also incorporated findings from the potential study. And most importantly, the stakeholder meetings are where we discuss the barriers to implementing infrastructure efficiency projects and then possible solutions to address those barriers. At these meetings, we also incorporated ideas from the advisory committee, which we already talked about, and from formal stakeholder surveys, which John is going to talk about in a couple of minutes. The final note here, after we develop the action plan, we have a strategy to disseminate the results. This webinar is a big piece of that, and we're looking for opportunities to present our results at association meetings and so forth. And since we're getting study funding from the Department of Energy, we're also discussing how our findings might extrapolate to other states as well. This slide shows a visualization of the process I just described. Again, this is very high level. There's a ton of useful information on the project webpage that goes into much more depth on specific topics that we talked about at each stakeholder meeting. I highly recommend checking out the project webpage if you're interested. And again, we'll post the link on the final slide here. The key to the stakeholder meetings is that they're an iterative process. After we did a little bit of background work on the left side of the slide there, we went around this circle discussing with stakeholders and adding information from surveys, experts, potential study findings, etc. And eventually we honed our ideas into a coherent action plan of recommendations, which is the outcome of the project on the right side there. Okay, so we covered the process that we used to complete the projects. Now we're going to talk about the findings. Here are the findings from the statewide potential study. This slide distills the findings into a couple of bullet points. And again, I encourage anybody interested to check out the full report. In the report, these findings are broken down into different technologies, infrastructure sectors, utility types, and they add carbon emission impacts and all sorts of useful information. For example, we've found that roughly 1/3 of the available potential is in generation assets, while roughly 2/3 can be found in transmission and distribution. Or another way to break it down is that investor-owned utilities are sitting on a little bit more than half of the potential, while consumer-owned utilities have a little less than half. But the munis and co-ops should look more at their distribution systems, while investor-owns might focus a little bit more on generation. These are just examples. The report slices the data a couple different useful ways. The report also discusses how to interpret the results in detail and includes specific recommendations to capture the identified potential. For today, those recommendations have been rolled into the final action plan, so we'll discuss those soon. But for now, the most important takeaway from the potential study is summarized by the sentence in the green text box here on the screen. EUI efficiency potential is large enough that utilities should consider pursuing it as part of their SIP portfolio, but not so large as to significantly displace demand-side activities. At the beginning of the process, we had a vague idea that EUI efficiency could be worth going after, but there was a possibility that it wasn't really significant. The study showed that that's not the case. As the numbers show here, utilities can achieve approximately 9% of their energy conservation goals by implementing EUI efficiency projects. As the quote low-hanging fruit efficiency options like lighting and HVAC become more difficult to capture over time, this study shows that EUI is a good avenue to explore new opportunities. The other possible concern when we started was that there might be too much energy efficiency opportunity. Maybe utilities will no longer offer rebate programs to customers because they can just upgrade a substation or two and meet their whole goal. There's a statutory provision to prevent that. But our findings indicate that we also don't really need to worry too much about it in terms of available potential because on average, over time, there's a good chunk of potential for EUI conservation, but not that much. So now we move on to the findings from the stakeholder engagement project. Over the course of the 4 stakeholder meetings we talked about, we identified 17 separate barriers to implementing EUI efficiency projects. And in order to drive implementation, we need to reduce the barriers. So one way to look at the goal of the project is to discuss these barriers and come up with ways to mitigate or solve them. The action plan that we're going to be talking about shortly addresses 15 of the barriers that we identified. On this slide, I listed some of the most important barriers to implementation. I'll go through one of them quickly as an example, but I again encourage any of the attendees to review the final report or contact me or the Department of Commerce with questions if you're interested in more detail. So as an example, one of the barriers we discussed is the statutory requirement that demand-side conservation must account for 1% of electric sales. That means that in order to meet the 1.5% goal in SIP, a utility could plan to get 1% from the demand side and the other 0.5% from EUI. But the concern was that if you miss the demand side goal by just a little bit, it's not clear, maybe none of the EUI savings would count at all. So instead of missing your goal by a little bit, you've now missed your goal by a lot, and that added risk is a barrier to considering EUI efficiency projects. So that became one of the barriers we wanted to address as part of this project. So to continue on with our findings here, the core of the project again were the 4 main large stakeholder meetings. This is where we had presentations from experts, and most importantly, this is where we discussed those barriers and possible solutions to those barriers with stakeholders. The meetings themselves aren't really a quote finding per se, but the conversations there were the driving force behind the results. So in particular, we had a lot of interesting and useful presentations from experts in the industry. And I wanted to put this slide in here to illustrate the variety and depth of knowledge that was brought to bear on our project. We couldn't be more pleased with the number and quality of experts who came to our meetings to speak to stakeholders. We want to thank all of them for taking the time to come to talk with us. And I apologize for the small font on the screen, but I think the fact that we need to cram them on this slide really shows how much great information stakeholders had access to. Also, for webinar attendees, this is another plug to go check out the project webpage that contains all the presentation materials from the experts who presented at our stakeholder meetings. There are a lot of good resources there for anybody who's interested in infrastructure efficiency. The topics covered include infrastructure technologies, innovative policies, evolving infrastructure design trends, and ideas for how related initiatives like grid modernization, smart grids, and storage might overlap with conservation goals. Presenters included utilities, policymakers, and regulators, and they come from local, state, national, and even international perspectives. So all of the information that our presenters brought us was incorporated into our discussions and eventually the action plan recommendations, which we'll talk about shortly. For now, I'm going to turn it over quickly to John to talk about some of the other ways that we reached out to engage stakeholders.
All right, thank you, Travis. So a big component of the EUI Stakeholder Project was to better understand the familiarity, perceptions, and preferences associated with EUI efficiency. We worked with Wilder Research to conduct 2 surveys that would help us better understand these issues. The first of those surveys was conducted in the summer of 2017 and consisted of in-depth interviews with 25 different stakeholders. The second was conducted over a year later in November of 2018, and that was a follow-up web survey with 23 stakeholders responding. So for that first stakeholder survey, I'll dive into a little bit of the details. In order to get a diverse range of perspectives, one-on-one interviews were conducted with a pretty broad range from municipal cooperative utilities, investor-owned utilities, all the way to local government and clean energy organizations. One of the main, most significant findings that was a pretty high-level question was, are the efficiency gains from EUI projects moderately or extremely important in the actual decision making that goes into those supply side efficiency projects? And over 55% actually said yes, they're either extremely or moderately important. Only 9% said not at all. So that was a good sign that we saw that people considered the efficiency component of EUI projects to be important. However, they noted a caveat that while stakeholders thought efficiency gains are important, those projects still have to be cost effective and meet other criteria for reliability, safety, and just general need for that project. Sorry, getting ahead of myself here. So this shows some results from a few additional questions. One of the findings was that most of the stakeholders felt that the savings should continue to be counted from EUI projects towards the savings goals. However, there was less support for counting them towards the spending goals or for paying for them with SIP funds. In general, there were a few consistent things that people brought up that were considered barriers to the supply-side efficiency projects. The first was what Travis had noted previously, that prior to this project, there was the 1% DSM rule in which utilities needed to hit that 1% savings on the DSM side before EUI projects would be counted in the savings. However, guidance was issued in response to this note by stakeholders. Guidance was issued by DER in 2018, and you can reference the document. It's called Claiming Energy Savings Through Electric Utility Infrastructure Improvements and the Energy Savings Carry Forward provision, where now, as long as the plan states that the utility will hit the 1% DSM threshold, then EUI savings will be counted as even if the actual results do not reach 1%. Another consistent note that stakeholders brought up was that they would prefer even more clarification for what the EUI projects can be, and as well as the rules and processes around those projects. Overall, there were many positive impacts noted by survey respondents of supply-side efficiency projects being included in SIP, including encouraging a more holistic approach to energy efficiency and helping utilities meet the 1.5% savings target, as efficiency opportunities on the DSM side become potentially more challenging. Consistent negatives or drawbacks that some noted were included that EUI projects may not be strongly influenced by efficiency considerations, and that stakeholders want to make sure that these projects would not have already happened anyway and are just being filed for the savings. All right, so once we got done with that first survey, there was over a year that went by, and then we wanted to come back and take a look at what, if any of those perceptions had evolved, and get some additional information on what stakeholders were thinking in terms of EUI efficiency. So for this round, we switched to a web survey format, primarily to alleviate the time burden for respondents. Those first surveys were an hour and a half each, one-on-one. And we also had a more defined set of research questions that were more conducive to a web format. And those included questions on the EUI policy, energy savings potential, goals and metrics, the TRM, as well as the dedicated rider. A couple of the key findings were that overwhelmingly stakeholders agreed that EUI projects are an important component of energy efficiency policy. However, only 43% thought that there should be more emphasis on EUI savings in terms of overall policy. Another thing to note is that even though we have, DER has issued multiple guidance documents over the course of this project, there's still some uncertainty with those documents and the subjects that they refer to. And so most preferred, or it would encourage the DER to invest more time in clarifying those regulatory policies, just because there's still a little bit of uncertainty in some people's minds. So in touching a little bit more on those guidance documents that were issued, so these were the two that were, one was issued in early 2018 and the second was issued in later in 2018. And almost all respondents, over 90%, were familiar with the Claiming Energy Savings guidance document. Fewer, although still in the majority, were familiar with the Determining Normal Maintenance Activities. Most, over 80% in the first case and 60% in the second, thought that these guidance documents would make it at least somewhat more likely that utilities would implement future EUI projects, which was nice to see. And finally, this is a question that relates directly to the potential study results, not through the stakeholder project. It was just a general question about, do people think that the savings that were estimated in the potential study, are they in line with what they perceived, or are they too high or too low? And the majority thought they were about right. However, some considered that this was probably a conservative estimate, given that they had known of some large EUI projects. But that was good to see that very few thought that the potential was too high. And so if any of you would like to dig in more to the details of this question or others that were either in the first or second survey, I would encourage you to check out the full report on the website. There's actually individual reports for both of those surveys that you can examine yourself. So now I'll hand it back to Travis.
Okay, thanks, John. So after conducting the surveys and hosting the large stakeholder meetings, we now get to the action plan recommendations. I want to zoom out just for a second here to remind us all what the goal is. This slide shows a visual representation of where we hope that these efforts lead. We actually stole the concept for this graphic from something that Joe Palladino at the Department of Energy developed. So thanks, Joe and DOE, for this template. This is how we see energy efficiency adoption over time in Minnesota. We look at it as a sort of staged approach to eventually integrating greater EUI efficiency into the normal course of business for utilities. So right now we're at stage one, where there are business case or bottom line reasons to achieve a certain level of efficiency in the grid. In stage two, we hope to spark a growing understanding of the value of increased EUI efficiency, specifically in terms of helping utilities achieve their conservation goals. In practice, this means that we're leveraging SIP tools to drive early implementation of higher efficiency infrastructure. And then stage three is when we envision that EUI efficiency as a part of SIP is fully understood and integrated into the infrastructure planning process. Effectively, at this point, there would just be a line item on the cost-benefit analysis for infrastructure designers that incorporates the value of increased efficiency as a normal step in the design process. And so for the projects that we're talking about today, this is where we see them fitting into the long-term vision for EUI efficiency. Specifically, we're leveraging the successful SIP tools that have worked on the demand side to jumpstart this first climb up to the inflection point on the diagram. So after early EUI efficiency projects gain some momentum, we hope that they become easier to evaluate and are integrated into the planning process. So to unlock the potential for EUI within SIP, we developed the draft action plan, which consists of recommendations for stakeholders. The plan includes 15 major recommendations with 29 sub-recommendations. Some of these are direct, immediately actionable recommendations, while others are more along the lines of recommending continuing the conversations that this project started. The draft version of this report is available today in the webinar link on your screen, and we'll show the link again at the end of the presentation. The section of the report that presents the action plan also briefly summarizes the stakeholder discussions that led to the development of the recommendation and refers back to the barriers that we think the recommendation is intended to address. Over the course of the project, we also developed quite a few resources that we think will be useful for stakeholders, and the recommendations also point to those resources, again, to hopefully lower the barriers to eventually implementing more EUI efficiency projects. This is the list of 15 major recommendations that are included in the action plan. We're not going to go over all of them in detail on this webinar, but they're included here just to give you a reference point for what the recommendations consist of. I tried to sort the list of recommendations into neat color-coded categories, but a lot of them really could fit into several categories, so this is just sort of a loose grouping overall to help organize and process them here. So I pulled out some of the most important recommendations developed as part of the action plan. We'll want to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A, but I'll spend the remainder of the time until then going through as many of these as we can in a little bit more detail. In terms of why these were chosen as the most important, there's not an exact science to it, but it's a combination of those recommendations that include the clearest actions and add the most understanding to the EUI landscape or are easier to accomplish. But really the biggest factor is that I chose the recommendations that address the most important barriers, which we determined by surveying stakeholders a couple of times over the course of the project. So the first recommendation is to review the policy guidance documents issued by the Department of Commerce concerning EUI projects. Over the course of the project, Commerce issued 2 formal guidance documents addressing 4 specific issues related to EUI projects. All of these clarify issues that were murky at the outset, like the 1% demand-side threshold requirement that both I and John talked about earlier. And there's also guidance to help determine the meaning of normal maintenance when it comes to EUI, which is a pretty important factor for calculating conservation credit because it defines the baseline to compare to. And then there's a step-by-step review process that Commerce recommends for utilities to follow when they consider completing EUI efficiency projects and claiming conservation credit for them. I think the review process guidance document is especially important. If anybody is listening to this webinar and mostly convinced that EUI efficiency is worth going after, maybe you're thinking there might be a conservation voltage reduction project that your utility could implement, and if it could claim conservation credit, it might get approved by the board, but you're not exactly sure what that would entail or how it would work. How much conservation credit will it achieve and how do you go about claiming it? I think the starting point from here is that review process guidance document. It might be the best first place to go check after this webinar. There will be links to these documents here in the last couple slides of the presentation. So another recommendation is to explicitly establish connections between SIP personnel and infrastructure planners at utilities. This kind of seems obvious if you think about our goals for this project. But from the outside, if you're not explicitly thinking about it, there may not be many opportunities in a regular business day for SIP people to talk to design engineers. So infrastructure designers may be looking at design options and thinking if they had a little more budget, they could make the system more efficient. And down the hall from them, there's someone looking for ways to spend their SIP budget to achieve conservation. In some cases, just arranging to have these people talk to each other might raise awareness of the opportunity. The recommendation comes with a couple specific sub-recommendations that we think can help with the goal of raising awareness, but the big point is just to get those conversations started. So another recommendation is to apply screening tools. As part of the potential study, GDS developed screening tools to evaluate EUI measures at a high level to estimate savings and cost effectiveness. These are not design tools. They're screening tools that help determine the conservation value of EUI projects. By adding some confidence to the estimated value, these tools reduce the effort required by utilities to consider EUI projects in SIP, which address the barriers that stakeholders identified. Again, we'll have a link to these tools in the final slides of the presentation. Currently, there are 4 types of projects that have screening tools. Each one is based on the associated TRM measure. The 4 are conservation voltage reduction, low-loss conductors, high-efficiency transformers, and generation heat rate improvements. The slide here shows a screenshot of the tool that can be used to screen possible CVR projects. Oops, skipped a slide there. Getting to the next recommendation, for stakeholders interested in digging in deeper into the nuts and bolts of where we found infrastructure potential and how, we recommended reviewing the potential study report. There's a lot of overlap between the potential study and the action plan, but the specific recommendations through the potential study are a little bit more technically focused, and stakeholders might be interested in a full description of the methodology and more detailed results. So this can provide context for the recommendations and additional detail that might help identify possible targets for conservation opportunities in Minnesota. And then I think this is the last recommendation I'm going to go into a whole lot of detail on. If you want to talk about any of the others, we can do it in the Q&A section. This recommendation is to combine our findings about how EUI fits in SIP with other grid-related initiatives. So there are a lot of exciting new initiatives in the utility industry today that get a lot of buzz, like smart grid, microgrids, advanced metering infrastructure, battery storage, renewables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of them. Most of the new initiatives fit under the umbrella term grid modernization, which is what this slide is trying to show. The point is that a lot of grid modernization efforts involve infrastructure planning. So the recommendation here is to look for ways that the goal of improving infrastructure efficiency overlaps with the goals of grid modernization. So as utilities are considering the strategies to modernize the grid, they should also consider the possible impacts of increased infrastructure efficiency in terms of helping to achieve conservation goals. If stakeholders recognize that EUI efficiency, stakeholders recognize that EUI efficiency is just one initiative among many related ones, and it may be possible to harness momentum across initiatives, leverage resources among the projects, and achieve common goals, which adds value across the board. So just as an example, if a utility is considering an AMI deployment project, and they're adding up the costs and benefits, and the decision is really close whether or not to go for it, maybe including the potential for achieving conservation goals with CVR will tip it over the edge and make the project go. So the other advantage of combining EUI efficiency with other initiatives is that it makes it more likely to continue to gain traction even after the end of this project. We recognize that EUI efficiency is far from the top priority at utilities, and if we can get EUI intertwined with all the other things that they're thinking about, we think it makes more likely that the findings of this project are more robust and likely to add value over time. So there are a couple of specific recommendations in the report for how to connect EUI to other projects, and we're going to make sure to reach out to some of those projects. But if you have ideas for other ways to combine EUI into related initiatives, we'd love feedback. That's really the point of this recommendation. In a really narrow sense, this project creates tools to achieve conservation goals through SIP and help utilities meet their conservation goals. But then in a broader sense, this project really fits into a big picture of where the future of the electricity grid is going. So I just want to really quickly tie this all together with a quick summary. We've identified significant potential for EUI efficiency improvement in Minnesota. We've created some tools that we think will help utilities unlock that potential. And we're specifically focused on applying SIP tools to drive EUI efficiency, and we think we've made some clarifications will help that process smooth over and move more smoothly. And from a big picture perspective, we think EUI efficiency within SIP fits well with the general direction of the industry today. So overall, we think there's great opportunity to apply SIP tools to drive improved electric utility infrastructure efficiency in Minnesota. So now we have one slide here on requested feedback here at the end of the project. So before we go to Q&A, I want to talk about that final opportunity for feedback. We posted the draft action plan on the project website today, and it's in the webinar link on your screen. If you're interested in providing feedback, we're accepting comments on the draft until May 3rd. Specifically, we're looking for feedback about whether the recommendations are clear, if the report is organized usefully, if you'd like to see any more depth of discussion. At this point, we're not anticipating that we're going to make any changes to the actual content of the findings. Also, just to be clear, because I know it gets a little confusing, we're looking at feedback on the draft action plan, The final potential study report is also available this week. That one is finalized and it's final. Okay, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think we're going to turn it over to Adam here for Q&A to see if we got any questions from webinar attendees.
All right, thanks, Travis. Yeah, just a reminder that people can type in their questions into the question box in GoToMeeting, and we can answer them as they come in. So I guess one question is, how can utilities build upon the results of the UI potential study and kind of apply them to identify opportunities in their own service territories?
Yeah, so a couple of the ways to use the potential study results. The findings in the potential study are, first of all, broken down in a couple of useful ways that can help point utilities towards where they might find potential in their service territories. But then one of the other things that we recommend in the potential study is that utilities can conduct their own internal survey of their potential for interest, and we kind of talk about how to do that. And there's a couple of different high-level ways to do that. One is to just monitor your line losses. You can do a line loss survey or a study, formal one, or you can even just take a real high-level look at your power purchases and your retail sales. You subtract one from the other, and you get a kind of an idea of what your line losses are. And if you track that over time, you can kind of look at where your opportunities for improvement might be in your distribution system. So that's just one example of a way to go find the potential that exists. And then the other is that there aren't that many unique technologies in the infrastructure system. So by the time you start thinking about it, most of the design engineers at a utility will probably know off the top of their head where there are going to be inefficiencies. And if you start talking about the opportunity to improve those efficiencies using SIP resources, most likely there are going to be a lot of good ideas jump off the top of their head.
Cool. Could you talk about what were some of the highest potential EUI technologies that were identified in the potential study? What was the biggest surprise? What was the largest potential?
Yeah. So the biggest surprise to me was that there's actually quite a bit of room for improvement in just conductors, transmission and distribution, in the physical wires, the conductors that you think of them as basically just a static component of the grid, and there's probably not all that much room for improvement. But it was a surprise to me that by using newer technologies and low loss conductors, there's a pretty big chunk of potential for improvement there, and I doubt that anybody's going to be able to justify going out and replace existing functional lines. But if you start thinking about as you have to replace them on failure or for load growth, if you consider higher efficiency options than you would have in the past, and you can justify that by applying SIP resources to cover the gap between those two, there's actually quite a bit of room for improvement there. So that was the biggest surprise. The biggest single technology that offers the most room for potential efficiency gains was conservation voltage reduction, which kind of makes sense in Minnesota because we're kind of behind the curve a little bit on AMI deployment. So there hasn't been a lot of CVR deployed in the state. So that means that there's still a lot of opportunity to deploy that and achieve conservation. That sort of tracks with AMI deployment. So if there might, as AMI is being deployed, if utilities are, be sure as you're deploying it to consider the potential for implementing CVR once you've deployed it, and make sure that you choose an AMI package that has the functionality that can implement CVR. Then, that is what we've identified as the biggest potential source of conservation in terms of EUI conservation in Minnesota.
Great, thanks. So, question for John about the stakeholder process. Could you talk about some of the best practices for engaging stakeholders effectively? For example, did it help to divide stakeholders into several groups as part of the process, or?
Sure, Adam. So one of the things that we wanted to ensure throughout this project was that we had a diversity of organizations represented. That ranges from utilities to local government groups to clean energy organizations. With the utilities, for example, cooperative utilities face very different challenges for EUI than IOUs. The number of people per line mile is a lot lower in the cooperative territory, so they're just going to see a lot. They're going to have a different they're going to have different views on EUI projects. Furthermore, when we were recruiting the advisory committee for this project, we made it an open application process where we asked people to submit their both their credentials and then also why they were interested in serving on this project. So I think we get people with a lot of expertise that are also interested in participating, which I think was a big help. And then just overall, I think we wanted to make sure that there were multiple avenues where we could be collecting information from different stakeholders and from different types of stakeholders. So that's why we had the 2 different surveys, public meetings, consultations with and presentations from experts at those meetings and outside, and then also the website resources. So overall, engaging all of those different stakeholders through different avenues and not assuming that we knew the answers to the questions, which I think we were posing in some cases for the first time, all helped to, I think, make it a good stakeholder process.
Great, thanks. So currently, utilities are able to add avoided line losses to at the meter savings. Would you say that EUI savings may be offset by reducing demand side savings as a result?
So that's from Joe Plummer. Thanks, Joe. I'm sure you know the ins and outs as well or better than anybody else. My guess is, well, I don't think it will be offset. I think if you consider the interactive effects of the whole system, by improving the efficiency of the infrastructure, I think what Joe is saying, then when you replace a light bulb at the end user, you're actually getting slightly less savings overall because the whole system was more efficient in the first place. So I guess over time, as you adjust those line loss factors that go into the demand side calculations for SIP, maybe over time it would reduce the value slightly of demand side, but I think the overall benefit of EUI efficiency is still going to be far greater than the slight reduction in the demand side savings. And I don't have a specific number or percentage, but you could just assume that those line loss factors go down by a slight 1% or whatever. That achieves greater efficiency across the entire system, and that's not going to offset the demand side efficiency that you could achieve by implementing demand side programs and projects.
Interesting. Could you talk about a little more about how EUI efficiency kind of benefits utility ratepayers? DSM measures directly benefit ratepayers, and the connection is more obvious. With EUI, it's a little more, unclear.
Yeah. So if you help a customer pay for an LED light bulb, and then the next month their bill is reduced, it's a direct linear connection. You can say that this helped that customer reduce their electric bills, and it's a very visible connection. And it's like you say, it's less visible on the EUI side, but it still goes back to the customer in the end, because if you're improving the efficiency of the system or the infrastructure that's used to deliver the electricity to the customer, what it means is that over time you're delaying or offsetting the need for building new generation facilities. You're also reducing the need for higher capacity transmission lines and distribution systems, and that overall reduces the cost of the fuel costs and the input costs for delivering electricity to customers. So that will, over time, there won't be a line item that they see on their bill and they won't be able to compare from one month to the next, but over time that does save consumers in the state of Minnesota money, and it's a direct benefit to the customers.
Great. Maybe one or two more questions. So what are some of the key lessons from the project that other states can use and implement to drive EUI efficiency?
Yeah. So well, the unique situation that we're in Minnesota is that our statute specifically says electric utility infrastructure projects can count towards our conservation goals. And that it's explicitly spelled out in statute. So that's really what sparked this whole project, is we want to figure out how much efficiency and how much, how to go get that. So in other states, I think that the technology and the systems that we deliver electricity to anybody in the country in any state is similar. So all the findings apply pretty well equally to other states, and you can sort of scale it by the number of consumers, and you could adjust it for meter density or something like that. But for the big picture, most of the findings apply to other states. But the one thing that you have to do first is verify whether you can use states' conservation tools for infrastructure projects. So other states, that would be the first step to do, is to either check to see if you can currently do it, or verify or change the existing policies to make sure that your conservation tools can apply it to infrastructure. And then from that point, all the findings from this project can extrapolate pretty well to any other jurisdiction outside Minnesota.
Great. Thanks, Travis. Well, I don't see any other questions at this point, so I'll turn it back to Mary Sue.
Hey, great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Adam. It was a really good presentation. So we're just going to end here with a little more information, as Travis alluded to, on where to find more sources on this project. Whoops. This slide has a lot of different links on it, and if you download the slide set from the GoToWebinar panel, you'll be able to get to all these links, these direct links. But basically, the efficiency potential study that people talked about in the presentation is available from multiple places. It can be downloaded from the GoToWebinar panel. It can be linked directly from this slide to the report, the PDF. Finally, it will also be available on either the department's Energy Data and Reports webpage, and is available on the EUI project webpage, both of which have links on this slide. And I'll just make another plug for the EUI project page, which Travis also talked about, and that's being hosted by CEE, and it contains a lot of additional information about all three of the EUI efficiency projects that Commerce did. It has a link to the draft EUI action plan that Travis mentioned, and in a few weeks it'll have a link to the recording from today's webinar. It also has the final report, as I mentioned already, on the potential study. And then by going to the resource tab, which is over on the right there, you can go to other materials from the stakeholder meetings and policy guidance documents and other links to EUI-related resources. And John referred to some of those stakeholder meeting resources and information that is available there that I think some of you will definitely be interested in and want to check out. On this slide, there are some direct links that are also available on the EUI program page that I just showed. But these are direct links because we thought these would be more interesting to people. In particular, one is the EUI policy guidance for Minnesota. There's two documents, one on claiming energy savings, the other on the review process for determining normal maintenance. Then there's an EUI project screening tool that Travis showed us a screenshot for that's available, and that's the direct link. It can also be linked to from the page, the project page. And then this is also a link to the most recent version of Minnesota's Technical Reference Manual that includes some EUI measures which were also developed by GDS. So before we wrap up here, both GDS and the department would really like to thank all of the participants in these EUI projects for their valuable contributions, but in particular, the stakeholders who participated in the whole process, organizations who shared data with the project partners, the advisory committee members, project partners, and then, of course, the U.S. Department of Energy. Thanks again for participating today. We really appreciate your interest. If you have follow-up questions about the application of EUI efficiency measures in SIP or about any of these EUI projects, please feel free to contact Travis Hink at GDS or Adam Zoet at the department. And then for future reference, at the bottom of this slide, you can find out about announcements about upcoming webinars and other news related to the Conservation Improvement Program in Minnesota in the SIP newsletter. You can use the link at the bottom of this slide to sign up for our email news list. So thanks again, and hope the rest of your day goes really well.